I don't believe that we're ever too old to hear stories. I really don't. I love to listen to stories. Stories communicate truths that can move us in a variety of ways. Some would lead us to laughter, some to sadness or fear. This season of Halloween, there's a lot of scary stories going around, I tell you. Others lead us into a sense of adventure. Often in our scriptures, the story leads us into some historical events, or maybe even to timeless truths. The story form helps us to remember those things of God and enables us more easily to pass on those things, just like I was saying this song helps us. It helps us to communicate the truths that we base our lives on. Today our story is found in the Old Testament, and it's named after a woman named Ruth. It's a short little book. It's only 4 chapters long, but these chapters are crammed full of history and of lessons of God's provision, his timing, and his redemption. This word redemption reminds me of something. How many of you use something like this? This is a coupon. What do we do with coupons? We kind of trade them in for something, don't we? We redeem coupons. It reminds me of the couponing craze in the 80s and the 90s. My mom got into that, and it seemed like we had coupons everywhere. Did any of you take part in that? See some heads bobbing up and down. My mom used to get free stuff in the mail all the time, and she would save labels to send in to get more free stuff, and she would get coupons for free stuff. It was just a crazy time. And I knew women who would have whole rooms dedicated to the couponing thing. They would have a room full of dresser drawers and file cabinets, and they would file labels, and they would file coupons, and they had places where they would stash the free stuff, because maybe, just maybe, they could give it away later as a gift or something. It was just crazy. It almost became an obsession. And you know what? I hear that's kind of coming back. It's making a comeback. Hopefully it won't become so obsessive as it did before. Well, we redeem coupons. That is to say, we trade the coupon for something of value. The coupons don't hold any value by themselves. They're just a piece of paper. And I think in the fine print it says something about the cash value is only 1/20th of a cent. So we would need 20 of these pieces of paper to just get 1 penny. It's really not valuable. The value of it is found in redeeming it for a product. We exchange it. We get something we want for it. And we'll see that in action later in this story of Ruth. Remember the idea of redeeming something. If you would, take your Bibles, if you have one. If you don't have one and want to use one, they're in the back of the pews. They're in front of you. We're going to turn to the book of Ruth. Ruth is found just after the book of Judges. It's closer to the front than anywhere else. It's kind of connected to the book of Judges a little bit, too. I'll give you an insight into that in a moment. So we're going to start with Ruth, chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name Naomi, and the sons of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Epaphrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband, even if I thought there was still hope for me. Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this, they wept again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." When Naomi realized Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. There's some significant things in this passage that aren't a part of our culture, and some of them can be a little difficult to understand if we don't really kind of define those things before we proceed. First, in the Israelite culture, when a man died and he left a young and childless widow, by direction of the Judaic law, the next of kin would be required to marry the widow and provide a child with her to protect the family line. The child was understood to be the heir of the deceased man. The deceased man's property also went with the deal and was transferred to the child as an heir. This was usually done by a brother to the deceased man. And this is why Naomi said what she did about being too old to marry again or to have other sons. Then when Ruth makes the statement, "May God deal severely with her if anything but death separates her and Naomi," she was using language from Naomi's tradition, where Israelites would make a covenant, binding each other to an agreement legally. This was a serious issue because a covenant was more than just a legal contract. It had moral and ethical things connected to it, and it holds life and death consequences. If anything but death canceled the agreement or violated the agreement, it meant the shedding of blood to the offender. Ruth is demonstrating a deep and meaningful, loyal commitment to Naomi. She's leaving behind the faith that she had practiced in Moab. She's leaving behind her previous life, the traditions that she held, the provision of her own father and mother, and the care they could provide, perhaps with another spouse. Next, this story is set in the midst of the period of Judges, and that's the book right before Ruth. That book is full of strife and war. But in the book of Ruth, we don't read about that. Perhaps the famine that was regionally affecting in Judah where they lived and caused them to leave was a result of the war. We don't know. But it would make sense. In Ruth, we read about famine and personal struggle. And it seems to be a micro view set within a much larger picture. Now, Naomi followed her husband to a new home, leaving behind all they had to a better place with more resources. The intent was this move would be temporary. It said for a time. And we know that there was more resources available for them in the land of Moab. And maybe there was work that Elimelech and his sons could do to provide for the family. There certainly was more food, we know. But it wasn't long before Naomi's husband dies. And we're not told what took his life. Maybe it was the war raging. Maybe it was a result of those things. We simply don't know. And it's interesting to note that he's referred to as Naomi's husband. Men usually were not identified in connection to their wife. Usually it was the other way around, that a woman was identified by connection of her husband. At any rate, Naomi was left without her husband. And after a time, her sons took Moabite wives. Maybe they had given up hope of ever returning to Judah, and they decided they just wanted to get on with their lives and build a life. Whatever the reason, Orpah and Ruth now enter the story. The scriptures say that 10 years had passed, and Naomi's sons also died, leaving her widowed and childless. Now, that was a big deal in those days, especially for a woman living in some strange place. Naomi would need someone to care for her in her old age, and her daughters-in-law were not necessarily obligated to be the ones to do it. Tragedy seemed to hit them really hard. Conditions are harsh, and Naomi is lost in grief, as you can imagine. In the middle of the grief among them, word reaches Naomi that the Lord has relieved the suffering in Judah and provided food. The famine is now over, and this gives her hope. She decides that perhaps the best thing for them is to journey back to Judah and rebuild a life there, connected to the people that she once knew before she left, the friends that she has, perhaps other family members that she has there. But this couldn't have been easy. Women just did not travel alone. The conditions were harsh. Her resources were thin at best, and it was dangerous. It was very dangerous. Her daughters-in-law begin on the road with her, but at some point Naomi stops and urges them to go back, to return to their mother's home. Perhaps she thinks they can find security and peace in a new home, maybe with another husband. She even prays a blessing over them from Yahweh. After objection from Orpah and Ruth, Naomi insists they turn back, and Orpah tearfully says goodbye. But Ruth clings to Naomi. She clings. It doesn't say that she just decided to stay with her or she decided to follow her, but she clings to her. And I can't help but see an emotional connection that they had with each other. Naomi's pleas resulted in Ruth's very sweet response, where she committed to Naomi to be with her, to be with her God, to be with her in her land. And we get a picture, just a little picture of her deep loyalty, that it's based on real affection and real commitment. We also can see proof of Ruth's faith, her conversion to Naomi's faith. Ruth has left behind everything she's ever known, everything she practiced in a religion, the traditions that they held in Moab. She's left it all behind, and she's made a real, heartfelt commitment to Naomi's God. As we'd said before, she made a covenant with Naomi, and she made a covenant with Yahweh to stick with Naomi. It was a costly decision. What did it cost you to decide to follow Jesus? Did it cost you anything? What did you have to turn away from in order to turn to Jesus? Naomi and Ruth find their way back to Judah, and Naomi's friends greet her enthusiastically, but they seem to be somewhat shocked at her appearance, and they even ask, "Is this Naomi?" Something has changed. Scholars believe that the years of hardship have left Naomi marked with stress-related aging, that changed her appearance. She answers them in a way that tells us she also bears the mark of hardship in her soul as well. She says the Lord has dealt harshly with her. And she uses a name for God that's not very common in our scriptures. The name means powerful, almighty one. And while it's difficult to understand the full meaning in English, she's saying that the Almighty has allowed hardship and not used his power to deliver her yet. There's a recognition of God's overarching rule in everything, of his might and his power. There's also recognition of his ability to deliver and to show compassion. Naomi acknowledges all this, and yet she holds fast to Yahweh and trusts his timing and his ways. Naomi says to her friends, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." I can't help but think both the women were still in grief over the loss of their husbands and sons. The move had to be difficult, and arriving home had to have given them some sense of peace, maybe comfort. Back in her own land, Naomi seems to pick up the responsibility of taking care of Ruth. She consents to Ruth gleaning in the fields. Basically, she sends her grocery shopping, the equivalent of grocery shopping. But remember, they were poor. They did not have resources to purchase the food items that they would need. In their poverty, they've got to glean or pick up what was left over when the harvesters went through the fields. In Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy, the law provided for the poor to find food at the edges of the fields. Farmers were told to leave the outer edges and to not pick a field clean in order to provide for those that needed the help. Naomi instructed Ruth in this tradition and sends her out. Ruth finds herself in the fields of a man named Boaz. He's known to be strong and influential, a leader in town, and he's well respected for his acts of compassion and justice. Ruth is at this point unaware that he is related to Naomi. Boaz asks his foreman about Ruth, and it's interesting that he notices her among so many other women working in those fields. What was it about her that made her stand out to Boaz, that he would ask about her? He's told she's the Moabite woman who came home with Naomi. He's also told about her hard work, that she hasn't stopped, that she doesn't rest like the other women do. And Boaz either takes pity on her, or he's taken with her good reputation that she's earned in such a short time. Either way, Boaz instructs her to remain in his field to glean, not to go into another field. This reminded me of our God. Remain with me. Don't chase after the others, but stay in my field. Boaz also makes a way for her to glean where others are not allowed by following the harvesters more closely. Farther into the center of the field where gleaning usually was not allowed. Not only that, but he tells his men, don't bother her. Don't harass her. Leave her alone to glean. In fact, pull out some of the grain heads and drop them for her that she may find more. The story doesn't give us a lot of detail about why Boaz cared for Ruth in this way, with so little knowledge of who she was. With his reputation and integrity, perhaps it was second nature to go the extra mile, especially when he discovered her connection to Naomi that was a relative of his. It seemed to be easy for him to extend such kindness, almost second nature. There's no angst over having to give up anything, or no reluctance at having to care for someone who's obviously so poor. He doesn't seem to be inconvenienced at all. So Ruth goes home at the end of the day with a huge amount of grain. I imagine she could barely carry it. Naomi is amazed at the amount and asks where she was gleaning. And I can almost see her going, "Where on earth did you get all that?" She's shocked. When she hears it was the property of Boaz, she praises God and exclaims that Boaz is one of the kinsman redeemers. He was someone related to their family that would be able to redeem the family line. How God has orchestrated the coming together of all these people and all these resources to take care of these two women is so worthy of loud praise. The testimony of praise is a powerful thing when God is so evidently at work. Praise should be quick on our lips when God is at work in our lives. Naomi decides it's time for her to maybe help arrange a husband for Ruth. She coaches Ruth on the process of how we do this here in Judah. She gives her very specific instructions on how to approach Boaz. And Ruth does as she's told. Whether she understands what's going on is difficult to tell. The scene is full of symbolism and these things that she does that don't really apply even today, even in the land that she was from. I don't think it's still practiced. Reading from chapter 3, verses 1 through 8, it says, "One day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, 'My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servants' girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you're there until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do.'" Now, I'm sure all you ladies know what's going on, don't you? Didn't you sneak into your future husband's bedroom and uncover his feet to make him marry you? It's just really odd, isn't it? I can't even begin to understand the symbolism of that. There's a lot in here that seems really strange. But there's also some beautiful symbolism as well. Reading further in the story, there's a request made to spread the corner of his garment over her. It can also be phrased, "Spread your wings over me." It's also said, "Cover me with your wings or your apron or cloak." Men wore a cloak that was large and long like a vest, and the corners of the front of it were called wings. It's the imagery of a mother hen covering her chicks with her wings in protection and warmth. It was a symbol of a man taking responsibility for a woman he wanted to marry. Some scholars even believe that that action was the act of marriage itself. Boaz sees this as an act of great kindness. That always puzzled me. Why would he think that that was kind? He says it's rather than running after younger, more attractive or exciting men, she has chosen to connect herself with him. She has held true to the practices of her new faith and has been obedient to the instructions of that faith. Boaz finds this very attractive. There were younger men that were also kinsman redeemers, younger relatives that could have done this act of redeeming the family line. And she chose Boaz, or rather God chose Boaz. He sends Ruth home with gifts for both her and Naomi, and again, she can barely carry it. And he proceeds to take care of any legal requirements that are needed that day to take Ruth under his care as the kinsman redeemer. His wisdom in the way he accomplishes this in the city gates shows his genuine concern for Ruth. What in the world can we find in this story to take home with us today? Is it that we take our husband's shoes off? I don't think so. Maybe we should ask, who do we find a connection with in this story? Maybe it's Naomi. She follows her husband to a strange town with new traditions and new surroundings. She's widowed and then loses her children. Reminds me of Job. By her statement to her friends when she arrives back home, we can learn a lot about how to endure hardships. Her answer seems a little bit like, "Oh, woe is me." But if you really think about what she's been going through, she's probably still grieving with her daughter-in-law about the loss of their husbands and her sons. Her answer, I think it's still appropriate. I think it's still appropriate for her to come to her friends. In that culture, grieving was a public thing. Perhaps she needed that. Perhaps she needed that tradition once she came home, and she found comfort in that. Remember the name for God that she used, the one that meant Almighty and Powerful One? The mood of the name also carries with it the idea that God will choose to relieve her suffering, but it is in his timing. Naomi knows God has been faithful to her people for generations past and has provided for every need. He's provided manna in the wilderness, ravens for the complaining, water in the desert, a pillar of fire to warm them, and a pillar of smoke to shade them as he guided them to the promised land. All these stories had been passed on for generations and come to Naomi and Ruth. Naomi remembers God's faithfulness. In Romans 5, it teaches us what Naomi is showing us, that we can embrace the hard things in our lives because God does not leave us in the shadows. There is hope. Romans 5 says, we also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us because God has poured out his love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit whom he's given us. Thank God. Maybe we identify with Ruth. There seems to be times and seasons where God places us in a time of hard work. Ruth worked hard and earned great respect by the way that she performed her care and responsibility for Naomi and for herself. Those around Ruth recognized quickly where her values were. Maybe God is calling you to come alongside someone and help them by doing something with your hands, your back, or your feet. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Thessalonians commending them for their love for one another. And then he also went on to say, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to work with your hands just as we showed you, that you may win the respect of outsiders. Isn't that what Ruth was doing? Coming alongside someone in Christian love sometimes means we come alongside to work alongside. And like Ruth, it may mean leaving behind some of our own things and ways, some of our own traditions, some of our own comforts. What about Boaz? Can we identify with Boaz? He used his position and influence to create a protected environment for Ruth to work in. He used his resources to provide for Naomi and Ruth. Boaz reminds me of Oskar Schindler. The movie Schindler's List was and continues to be one of my favorite movies. Oskar Schindler used his influence and resources to save as many Jews as he could. He put them to work, and he provided for their needs as much as he could with Nazi Germany all around him. He literally saved thousands of Jews. What do you have within arm's reach that can be used to help others who are struggling? Your resources may be just what God needs to provide protection and safety for someone that's struggling. Your influence may be needed to be a voice for someone who has lost theirs. God may just need to use your resources and your influence to be the redeeming force in someone's life. Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, one whose responsibility was to set things right again for the family line. Resources and influence that we have can be used to set things right again for the family of God. Would you let God use them? Who do you identify with? Will you open up your life now and allow him to use you in whatever circumstances you happen to be in? I've asked Phil and some of the band members to come and lead us in a song. As we sing this, will you think about Ruth and Naomi and Boaz? Who do you identify with? Who do you find a connection with? Whether you're in that position or you can work like someone in that position. Let God speak to your hearts and your minds. Let's leave today with Romans 12, verses 1 and 2 in our minds and our hearts. Paul wrote to the Romans, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy." That means remembering everything that he has done for us. Because of that, present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Some versions would say it's your reasonable act of worship. He gave it all. Why would we not give back? Amen. Have a wonderful week.